All right, here's the deal. ICE and illegal immigration is so complex and confusing to everybody because our immigration laws are an insane patchwork of rules going back to 1952, and because there's a shocking amount of people out there who don't understand how law enforcement works. Combine these two things together and, well, you get what we've been seeing recently. I'm Jake the Lawyer, and welcome back to Internet Esquire. All right, let's be honest. If you're like most people, you get the majority of your information from your phone and from social media. That's not me bashing on it. It's not like mainstream media is any better. In fact, I think it's objectively worse. It's just that what we're dealing with here is a huge topic. In fact, it's several huge topics all stacked together and wrapped around each other and then some. We're dealing with federal law enforcement of our entire immigration system. That's not something you're exactly gonna get a comprehensive review on from Twitter. So today, let's take a look through how this whole thing comes together, where it comes from, how we got here, and some of the most common questions and debates we're seeing online right now. Buckle up, because if you want to understand La Migra and how the immigration law system works, you must be crazy. Here we go. Following the events of September 11th, 2001, the 107th U.S. Congress passed the Homeland Security Act of 2002, and it was signed into law by President Bush in November of the same year. Primarily, the Homeland Security Act created the Department of Homeland Security, otherwise known as DHS, and to give you a sense of scale in terms of how big the creation of the DHS was, it was one of the largest reorganizations of federal government since the Department of Defense was created in 1947 after World War II. And that is also why propertyless millennials keep sharing the meme that the country you grew up in no longer exists. Anyway, as part of this reorganization, all authority over U.S. immigration law was transferred to DHS. U.S. immigration law itself originates from the Immigration and Naturalization Act, otherwise known as the INA. First passed in 1952, this act was then codified into Title VIII U.S. Code, which is the code that we generally refer to when we say immigration law today. Did you know that's what we call our entire body of federal law today? The United States Code. That's right, it's over 50 different titles covering everything from food stamps to crimes to immigration, and in total, it's over 60,000 pages. And Title VIII alone, which covers the immigration law, is over 500 pages. And just for reference, this is a 500-page book. Also, it's a pretty good one, you should read it. But that's how many pages there are just on immigration. Shouldn't be complicated. Funny side note, as if I wasn't on enough of a tangent already, did you know that everything in the US Code must draw its actual legal authority back to an enumerated power in the US Constitution?
Let me tell you something. You're suspect.
Yeah, we'll fight about that later. Anyway, that's immigration law, Title VIII of the US Code, resulting from the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1952 and added on to ever since. And the authority over how all of this works belongs to the Department of Homeland Security. But the government being the government, they didn't just leave this all under one roof. No, they created 3 separate agencies to deal with different aspects of the immigration code. The U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service, otherwise known as the USCIS, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, otherwise known as Border Patrol, or CBP, and U.S. Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, otherwise known as ICE. Well, all 3 of these agencies have some form of law enforcement capability. The primary mission of ICE is to serve as a law enforcement agency, with a mission statement to protect America from the cross-border crime and illegal immigration that threaten national security and public safety through criminal investigation and enforcement of immigration law. Specifically, this breaks down into 2 realms that ICE has. First is Enforcement and Removal Operations, otherwise known as ERO, and second is Homeland Security Investigations, otherwise known as HSI. Enforcement and removal operations are responsible to enforce the law and remove people who are here illegally, as the name implies. They're supposed to identify, arrest, detain, and remove people who are here in violation of US immigration law. It is that division of ICE from what you're seeing most of the viral videos online today. Homeland Security Investigations are responsible to investigate crimes that cross the US border, which use the immigration system as a tool. ICE differs from Border Patrol because the primary focus of ICE is on the interior of the country, while the primary focus of Border Patrol is on the actual perimeter of the border and the boundary of the nation itself. Now, I can hear the comments saying already, well, if that's the case, then why is Border Patrol helping ICE with interior enforcement? So let's go on a little bit of a side road and just start answering some of these questions, and then we'll keep going. There's a common misconception out there that Border Patrol is restricted from operating more than a 100-mile distance from the actual physical border of the United States. This is a misconception that stems from Title 8 U.S. Code Section 1357, which authorizes Border Patrol additional warrantless search capabilities within a reasonable distance from any external boundary of the United States. Specifically, it's this reasonable distance rule that has generally been interpreted as a 100-mile distance from the border or boundary. It does not mean that Border Patrol is prohibiting from operating within the interior of the country. And given that both Border Patrol and ICE operate under the roof of DHS, the sole governing body of immigration law in this country, Border Patrol is sometimes utilized alongside ICE when there is a needed surge in manpower in a given area. And for the record, this is not something that is unique to immigration enforcement. It's almost the exact same thing that local police departments do when they reach out to the county sheriff or the police department from the town next door to increase manpower when there is a big event such as a parade or some kind of political rally. Just because a sheriff's deputy typically works in the county doesn't mean that they don't have arrest authority when they're helping with that operation. And the same exact thing is happening here with Border Patrol. All right, as long as we're down this road, I can already hear the next question. Okay, but Border Patrol and ICE are executing warrantless searches and seizures inside the interior of the country, and that's definitely illegal, right? So again, we have another misconception. As you probably know, the warrant requirement comes from the Fourth Amendment in the US Constitution. Well, in general, the Fourth Amendment requires a warrant to be signed by a judge before a search can be conducted. There are several well-founded case law exceptions to this, and this predates ICE or Border Patrol. One of the most common exceptions is that police, ICE, sheriffs, any form of law enforcement does not need a warrant to simply ask a question to a person standing on the street. Roughly within immigration code, this is translated to 8 U.S. Code 1357A1. Any officer of the service shall have the power without warrant to interrogate any alien or person believed to be an alien as to his right to be or to remain in the United States. Now, the term interrogation here doesn't mean the normal custodial style interrogation that we usually think of when an officer says they're gonna take somebody downtown for questioning. It means exactly what it says it means. Any immigration officer can ask any person that is an alien or that they believe to be an alien just a simple question about their right to be or to remain in the United States. That does not mean it's unconstitutional, and it does not mean that they need reasonable suspicion or probable cause. Whether reasonable suspicion is required depends on whether the questioning is a Fourth Amendment seizure, a stop or detention, or is just a casual encounter. The Supreme Court, in cases like INS versus Delgado, has found that just questioning about identity or asking for papers does not by itself create a Fourth Amendment seizure. However, if an officer stops and detains you such that a reasonable person wouldn't feel free to leave, then the stop must be justified under normal Fourth Amendment processing and would require either reasonable suspicion or probable cause. That said, if you are already lawfully detained for another reason, officers don't need additional reasonable suspicion or probable cause to also ask you questions about your immigration status, so long as the questioning doesn't prolong the detention. That's the case of Mueller versus Mina. And when you consider things in total context, courts have time and again given a little bit more deference to law enforcement in these areas because they are dealing with greater risk. It doesn't mean that they can just violate the entirety of the Fourth Amendment and haul somebody off to a dungeon and torture them.
I want the money.
The second most common warrant exception is that officers do not need a warrant if the person that they are going to be seizing is likely to escape if the officers are first required to go and get a warrant. And Title 8 U.S. Code Section 1357 almost states this verbatim. Any officer of the service shall have power without warrant to arrest any alien in the United States if they have reason to believe the alien is in violation of admission laws and likely to escape before a warrant can be obtained for their arrest. But notably, this section also requires that if an alien is arrested, they shall be taken without unnecessary delay for examination before an officer with the authority to examine their right to enter or to remain. So this is sort of a codified safeguard here. It says, yes, you can arrest and detain them without a warrant, but you also must then, without delay, examine their status and determine that as soon as possible. Overall, this means that executing warrantless arrests inside of the interior of the country is not illegal, and it follows a line of reasoning that is consistent with all forms of law enforcement. These aren't some special privileges that only immigration officers get. All right, well, we're already deep into the Fourth Amendment issues here, so let's just tack on another one while we're at it. All right, another thing people are confused about. Warrantless street arrests by ICE do not then also give them the authority to enter people's homes without a warrant. There's special additional protections that exist at the place of a dwelling. So in general, if an ICE officer shows up at your door, this functions exactly the same way as any other law enforcement encounter would happen at your doorstep. If they ask to come in and you do not want them to, you can ask them to go back and get a warrant, or if they have a warrant, you can ask them to show you the warrant before they are allowed to enter the home. If you really do not want them inside, do not open the door unless they have a warrant. Simply asking you if they can come inside to answer a few questions can be considered consent, but to answer the basic question, no, in general, ICE officers cannot come into your home without a warrant. Now, be careful here. If you're currently running from ICE officers and you run into a home, even if it's your own home, that's hot pursuit, they can enter the home, and there's other little exceptions to that. But in general, they're standing at your doorstep, they arrive at your home, you're inside, you don't want to open the door, they need a warrant. Next question. ICE is arresting legal, peaceful immigrants. You can't just go around arresting people if they're not committing a crime. Well, there's a couple things here that I want to work through slowly. Number one, arrest doesn't mean that they're gonna throw you in jail forever. It means that they're going to detain you for a reasonable amount of time to determine your status. And then the second part of this, and this is the really, really important part that I want to make sure gets across, notice how Title 8 U.S. Code 1357 is written. It just says alien. It doesn't say legal alien, it doesn't say illegal alien, and it definitely doesn't say, well, if they're acting peaceful, they should be left alone. It just says alien. And for the purposes of immigration law, an alien is any person not a US citizen or national of the United States. That means legal, illegal, peaceful, or violent. So yes, that means peaceful, legal immigrants can be subject to these interrogation laws if an officer has reason to believe that they are an alien and that they're in violation of our immigration laws. That's the way that they're written. They're not made up, and they're definitely not happening because the ICE agents are going around acting as rogue agents. And honestly, if politicians could just please stop saying that, that would probably tone down a lot of the rhetoric.
What we saw today was a criminal murder. ICE is breaking the law.
But hey, no good tragedy goes to waste, right? Anyway, these are the real written codes that govern the way we actually execute and enforce immigration law. And they're super, super important to things like our national health, our security, and our sovereignty. So it's pretty important to be clear-cut about what they are. Okay, but they're arresting US citizens. This one is fair. ICE should not be arresting US citizens. And this isn't me making an excuse, it's just me explaining how this happens, okay? But anytime you have a large-scale enforcement operation where there are tons of people involved, mistakes can and do happen. So again, that's not me apologizing, but for the sake of clarity, let me contextualize this into an example. It's not unreasonable at all that if you take two people who are of the same family in the United States today, one could be a citizen and one could be an alien of any kind. In fact, this is way more common than people think, and it happens a lot more than you think. Anyway, it's also not unreasonable that one or both of those people might not speak English, and there might be some confusion in terms of what's happening in the given situation when somebody is being interrogated or asked questions, which might lead both of them to be detained. And tangentially, perhaps speaking English should be one of the things that's required to become a legal alien. It would definitely help avoid confusion in these types of situations, especially when communication in the same language is incredibly important. Anyway, in this scenario, if an ICE officer can't get a form of federal identification, which most people don't just carry around their passports, then it isn't entirely unlikely that they could both be detained, like I said. The officer might arrest both of them temporarily and then, according to the dictates of the statute, determine what exactly is their right to remain. Presuming that the officer has a reason to believe that they are in violation of the laws allowing them to be here, this is not out of the question, and I'm sure it happens probably all the time. Okay, but why are they arresting anyone in the first place? I mean, I've heard it said that they aren't even real police. So again, ICE and Border Patrol are federal law enforcement agencies, Sheriff Rochelle Bilal.
Professional law enforcement, I don't call them none of that. I call them made up, fake, wannabe law enforcement, because what they do is against not only legal law, but the moral law.
And while it's true, they're not your local police department, that doesn't mean that they're fake cops or rogue agents. They have actual arrest authority, and they are duly authorized by Congress to be a law enforcement agency. Just because they're not enforcing municipal or state law doesn't mean they're not real police. And along these lines, it also doesn't mean that they're not allowed to wear the police patch. A lot of people are confused about this. Use of the police patch by ICE officers is just simply a way to quick signal to the public that they are legitimate law enforcement. And this isn't something that, again, is some special exception to immigration law. It's something that happens across the board. And if you don't believe me, for the sake of clarity, let's just look up the definition of police. The civil force of a national or local government responsible for the prevention and detection of crime and the maintenance of public order. Thanks, Google. Okay, so if ICE is a real police force that is executing legitimate law, who gave them this authority? Well, as mentioned in the origin story, US Congress did when they created the Homeland Security Act of 2002. So here's how this works. Operationally, ICE performs its duties under the executive branch of government, which is the law enforcement branch of the federal government. As such, the president, any president, alongside the Secretary of Homeland Security, then determines the enforcement directives for ICE within the bounds of Title 8 U.S. Code, the immigration law. And Congress controls its funding and can pass future laws both expanding its funding or restricting it. And just so we're clear, this isn't something that is unique only to immigration law. This is the entire structure of our federal system. Congress writes the laws, the executive enforces the laws, and the courts get involved when somebody says something has gone wrong. So when somebody says that ICE is illegal or that it's a rogue agency, this is just fundamentally untrue. And if you're mad at that, you can comment bootlicker below for me explaining to you how the law works. We're gonna come back to some of these specific questions about ICE and enforcement closer to the end of the video, but this right now is the perfect time to transition to the question of immigration law itself and how we actually got here. One thing that most people don't realize when we talk about immigration law today is that it's not just one clean law. It's an insane patchwork of rules going back to 1952 that looks more like the Winchester mystery house of who gets in that's been built up, torn down, and renovated dozens of times. As mentioned, the spine of the whole thing is the Immigration and Naturalization Act, the INA, and this answers the basic questions that any country has to answer. So when we look at our immigration law, we can see that the framework is still there, but it's been cut up, amended, adapted, and stapled back together so many times that it looks like a bunch of pieces thrown into a filing cabinet more than it looks like a book. Over time, Congress has repeatedly been required to respond to new political pressures, new humanitarian risks, new labor laws, new security threats, and new court decisions by adding sections and repealing others and amending others, all without ever stopping to just rewrite the whole thing. So instead of one code, you get layers. Old rules, new rules. Rules that apply only after a certain date, rules that apply only before a certain date, and rules that depend on whether you were admitted, paroled, or never inspected. Unfortunately, all of this patchwork really matters because immigration law isn't about anything except for categories. It's like the Container Store of immigration law. The INA literally on paper puts everyone into a container. And then even once you've been put in a box, the following questions of the law ask again whether or not you're allowed to be in that box right now or not. And this is part of the reason why the internet is constantly arguing past itself, because when somebody says illegal immigrant over here or undocumented over here, one person might be thinking about illegal entry, one person might be thinking about an overstay, and at the end of the day, DHS has the very unenviable job of managing all of it. So to take that context, let me ask you one simple question. What is an illegal immigrant? And you might hear that and say, duh, it's anybody who's not supposed to be here. Well, that's true, let's try to be a little bit more specific. An illegal immigrant is any non-citizen who is in the United States without the legal permission our immigration law requires. It sounds simple, and this isn't me trying to gloss over a generally useful term or say that being illegally present in our country cannot also be a criminal violation. It can be. It's just, this is where the patchwork of laws begins to show its ugly head. And look, if you're one of those people who say that no one is illegal on stolen land, you can go hang out with the anarchists in the back of the bus, okay? You guys will have a great time with them back there. We'll bring you juice boxes. Everything's gonna be great. For the rest of us who'd like to actually understand this, let's move forward. US immigration law does not start by first asking the question whether you are illegal or legal. Instead, if you want to understand it without going cross-eyed, you need to look at it in terms of its architecture. It basically starts with a big decision tree that asks 4 questions in this order. First, who are you?
Who is your daddy and what does he do?
What type of person are you? What container can we put you in from the container store? Second, if you are an alien, what type of alien?
What kind of American are you?
We have a whole section of container boxes just for aliens, and we are wondering what type of alien are you, and are you allowed to be in that box? Third, how did you get here? The container store has many entrances, and that's why the first thing that immigration lawyers ask you is, how did you enter the country? And fourth, what are we gonna do with you now? Are you staying? Are you going? Or is it something else? That's pretty much the entire thing. It runs you through that decision tree at pretty much every instance, and for the record, that's me generalizing. Let's play this out. First, who are you? Under the INA, you are either a citizen or an alien. Now, there are not many people who fall into the US national but not US citizen box, and if you are one of those people in that container or that section of the store, you already know who you are, so I'm not gonna really go into that. I'm just gonna say US citizen. Okay, so who are you? You're either a citizen or an alien, and if you're a citizen, that's pretty much the end of the inquiry. If you're an alien, you go to the next part of the container store. What kind of alien? Okay, here's how this breaks down generally. If you're an alien, you're either an immigrant, a non-immigrant, a refugee, an asylee, or a parolee, and whoever came up with this is a dummy. Dad jokes. All right, let's go. Immigrants. Legally, not everybody who comes here is an immigrant in the normal way we use that word in common English. Under immigration law, and again, I have to speak in generalities here, an immigrant is anybody who comes here lawfully with the intent to remain permanently. Primarily, these are green card holders, or what we call lawful permanent residents. These are people like the spouse of a US citizen, or somebody on a long-term employment visa. But immigrants, in this context, are not just green card holders. They can also be somebody who is in the pipeline to receive a green card, such as the spouse of a US citizen who is applied to come to the States, but is still waiting abroad. Non-immigrants. Okay, this is the temporarily allowed to be here container department of the container department store. These are people like tourists, students on student visas, temporary workers and temporary service providers, and politicians and diplomats, or sometimes even the spouses or children of any of these people. Legally, the INA defines non-immigrants by a total of 23 actual categories, which I'm just not gonna get into. Either way, all of these non-immigrants are legally allowed to be here, but temporarily. If they want to remain past a certain point that is set forth in their visa, they either need to apply for that, an extension, or try to get into one of the other containers in the container store, like the immigrant container. So this is now when things get a little confusing, and if it wasn't confusing to you already, you're probably a savant, and we could really use you in the immigration department of the federal government. Please help. For the rest of us with normal brains, let's work through it slowly. Then you have refugees. Now, explicitly defined in Title 8 U.S. Code Section 1101, and to paraphrase for plain English purposes, a refugee is this: any person outside their country, or sometimes still in it in special circumstances, who can't or won't return because of past persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution based on race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or members in a particular social group. Generally, refugee status is a special legal mechanism that allows people to come into the United States from somewhere else in the world because of some type of humanitarian crisis. Like almost all forms of alien, your refugee status can change over time, and it can move to lawful permanent resident, green card holder, and even to US citizen. But typically, and this is a very important thing to keep in mind here, these are applied for when people are outside of the United States. You apply, and if your application is well-founded, then you get your status and you are admitted legally at a designated point of entry when you come into the United States. So who decides well-founded fear? Well, generally it's an immigration judge here in the United States, or sometimes it can be done abroad with things like the United Nations Refugee Agency. Now, strangely, 8 U.S. Code section 1157 basically leaves how many refugees can come into the United States each year entirely up to the president, with some limited oversight from Congress. It says the number of refugees who may be admitted under this section shall be such number as the president determines, and after appropriate consultation is justified by humanitarian concerns or is otherwise in the national interest. And while there are a few other quid pro quos to this, like there is with everything in the immigration code, this is generally how the refugee system works in the United States. Now, to be clear, this isn't like the leading cause of the immigration crisis in America. Going back as far as the early 1980s, there's really never been more than about 125,000 people per year let in under refugee status. But obviously, with the new administration, that number is down significantly. But the point is, this is kind of a wild way to do business. We're just allowing the president to sort of write down how many people he thinks should be allowed in as refugees each year, and then he kind of shows Congress some evidence of how this is supported with probably some research group that gets paid millions of dollars a year to do that, and then he takes it to them and they're like, that seems pretty reasonable, it's consistent with last year's numbers, go ahead. And then he can just sort of let people in. All right, let's pause for a moment. Before we can actually continue with that and finish with the different types of aliens that you can be, we actually need to take a detour and we need to go into a different section of the store called How Did You Get Here? Question number 3. In this part of the store, there are 3 boxes that you can potentially be in: admitted into the United States, paroled into the United States, or you can have entered without inspection. So let's start with what's familiar. Admission. As a general rule, any one of the aliens that I've already mentioned, immigrant, non-immigrant, or refugee, generally are admitted into the country through a designated port of entry. 8 U.S. Code 1101 defines this clearly. The term admission and admitted mean, with respect to an alien, the lawful entry of the alien into the United States after inspection and authorization by an immigration officer. Okay, great. So this means what you think it means. You arrive at an airport or you cross over a border patrol checkpoint, you hand your papers over to the immigration officer, and then they let you in to the country. Now, to be clear, just because you were legally admitted into the United States does not mean that you are also still legally allowed to be here. We'll get back to that in a little bit. Okay, without inspection. Entry without inspection is pretty much the you are here illegally scenario under pretty much every scenario, with exceptions, because you broke almost every rule we have in our container store Winchester mystery house of immigration law. Well, some people like to refer to this as undocumented because it's a little bit of a softer word. Legally speaking, the term undocumented has no more meaning in the immigration code than the term illegal does. So don't get caught in this BS argument about semantics. If you're talking about the law, we call them aliens. Doesn't matter what kind, just means not US citizen. Anyway, entry without inspection is the classic example of somebody running across the desert at night, or swimming across the Rio Grande, or some Canadian fisherman sneaking down through the boundary waters. I think they're just looking for big northern pikes, but I don't know. Anyway, this is what we most commonly think of when we use the term illegal immigrant. But again, don't forget, entry without inspection can still put you in several other containers. The next entry status you can have is paroled into the United States. This is where things start to get interesting. Paroled means that you have the permission to be here right now in the United States, but you actually weren't admitted. Section 8 U.S. Code 1152(5)(a) defines parole as the Secretary of Homeland Security may in his discretion parole temporarily under such conditions as he may prescribe only on a case-by-case basis for urgent humanitarian reasons or significant public benefit any alien applicant for admission, but parole shall not be regarded as an admission, and when the purposes of such parole have been served, the alien shall return to the custody from which he was paroled and be dealt with in the same manner as any other applicant for admission. What the heck does that mean? In a general sense, this means that you can be let out into the United States in the same way that a prisoner is let out on parole after serving a sentence. As with the terms of criminal parole, the terms of an immigration parole have specific conditions that are subject to you and your circumstances, such as how far you can go from the detention center, or when you have to report back, or any other terms that the immigration system may decide for you. Now here's where this gets really sticky and brings us back to our "what kind of alien?" question. As the code says, parole is supposed to be for urgent humanitarian reasons or significant public benefit. In reality, urgent humanitarian reasons has turned into a snafu almost of its own making through what we call the asylum system. Now, on its face, the asylum system works almost exactly the same as the refugee system. In fact, to determine whether or not you can be granted asylum, the immigration code uses the exact same language as refugees. I'm not kidding, they don't even reprint it into its own section of the code. Any person seeking asylum needs to show a well-founded fear of persecution. The main difference between asylum and refugee is that refugee typically happens outside of the United States, while asylum typically happens inside of the United States. And I gotta say, the asylum system has so many loopholes and what have yous and takes up so many resources that it makes the refugees look like American heroes. There is good argument to say that we might just be better off getting rid of the asylum system, or at least significantly restricting it. Perhaps that sounds a little bit extreme, but this is a mess. Here's how this works. Asylum allows anyone physically present in the United States to apply for asylum, even if they have no other legal status, and even if they entered without inspection. You heard that right. You can just show up at the doorstep of the United States and try to claim asylum. Now, I want to be clear. Just because you can do that doesn't mean that everybody who comes here is getting asylum. But it does mean that if you don't at least attempt to claim asylum and you just arrive on our doorstep unannounced, you will almost certainly and absolutely be turned around and sent back to where you came from. So obviously this creates a perverse incentive to apply for asylum, even if you're not really legally entitled to it. And from here you can begin to see the problem. We have to examine each and every asylum claim effectively on its own merits, and while the amount of asylum claims we grant each year hasn't really gone up, the number of applications for asylum has, significantly. This is not some Fox News talking point, this is just data from the Department of Justice. Now, while asylum status is subject to statutory bars and deadlines, all of these terms and conditions and deadlines are somewhat arbitrary and don't exactly line up with the way that we actually enforce and practice law here in America. For example, if you came here illegally and without inspection, who's to determine whether or not you made your asylum claim within 1 year of arrival? Or perhaps you filed for asylum previously and were denied, but you did it under a different name. People often don't realize how common it is in other countries to have 4 or 5 or 6 or more names. What can happen is you can have somebody who applied for asylum previously under a few of those names and were denied and just left the other ones off the document. Then they can be denied and come back and apply for again under their other names. And granted, that's fraud, but my point is, who's there to take count of it? Assessing each individual case of asylum requires a mountain of individual paperwork to be gone through by our federal officials. That's not me dunking on other people or cultures or people with 8 names, it's just the thing we have to do when we enforce our own laws. As a result, in practice, where it actually matters, the asylum system can become a nightmare of legal enforcement issues, removal pipelines, and other law enforcement actions that can all be happening at the exact same time. And there is no denying that this takes up a significant amount of federal resources. So sometimes people that apply for asylum are denied and removed, sometimes they are detained at a detention center until the outcome is determined, and sometimes they are paroled while they await the outcome. And again, while each individual parolee has specific terms that are a condition of their parole, people don't always follow the rules. Let's bring this back to ICE. Are you starting to see why this is so complex? Yes, ICE is the law enforcement agency tasked with enforcement and removal of people who are here in violation of the immigration code. And yes, any illegal immigrant is any non-citizen who is here in the US without the legal permission our laws require. But also, yes, it's kind of nuanced. And by kind of I mean, it's really complicated. And when there are an estimated 8 to 10 million completely unauthorized aliens in the country, plus another 4 to 6 million who may possibly have some kind of removal protection, you're not just gonna wave a magic wand over this thing and make it all be pretty and nice. So with all of that understanding, let's jump into a few more questions that are some of the most common questions and debates we're seeing online about ICE right now. So hopefully nobody else gets shot. Wish I was joking. Are peaceful immigrants committing a crime? I've heard it said online that illegal immigration is not a crime, or that there's a myth to illegal immigration.
Being in this country as an undocumented immigrant isn't actually a criminal charge. It's a civil offense.
This sounds like the skateboarding is not a crime argument, but I can assure you they are not the same thing, Tony Hawk.
This is a picture of Tony Hawk high-fiving Adolf Hitler.
Most of the time people say that illegal immigration is not a crime because they are referring to the way that the violations get treated and processed. They say this because most of the time the violations are treated through civil process, not through criminal process. But the reason for this isn't because violating our immigration code under any and all circumstances is not a crime. That's not a myth. It's simply because it's cheaper and easier to remove people under the civil process than it is to penalize them under the criminal process. And there are several reasons for this, but I'll give you an example. The classic entered without admission alien, no other legal status. Title 8 US Code 1325 has this to say about that. Any alien who enters or attempts to enter the United States at any time or place other than as designated by immigration officers shall, for the first commission of any such offense, be fined under Title 18 or imprisoned not more than 6 months or both. Gee, fined or imprisoned under Title 18, that kind of sounds like a crime. What is Title 18? Let's just run a quick Google search here. What is Title 18 of the US Code? Oh look, it's got an AI overview. Title 18 of the US Code is the primary federal criminal code, known as the Crimes and Criminal Procedure, essentially serving as the federal government's penal code.
No way!
But this is exactly my point. Summarizing things on TikTok or Twitter or YouTube Shorts doesn't exactly give you the whole picture, does it? Now don't get me wrong, there are obviously going to be some violations of the immigration code that aren't also criminal violations. But overall, the big ones, entry without inspection, those are crimes. You enter without inspection once, it's a misdemeanor. You enter without inspection twice, it's a felony. You can be criminally prosecuted for those things. We just choose not to do it because it's easier to kick you out. Okay, but on that note, it's only a misdemeanor, and everybody knows that misdemeanors aren't really crimes, are they? Okay, first of all, no, misdemeanors are crimes, and second of all, no, there's plenty of felonies you can commit by violating the immigration code. I'll give you an example. I don't even have to leave section 1325 of the Title 8 of the US Immigration Code. Here's what it says. Any individual who knowingly enters into a marriage for the purposes of evading any provision of the immigration laws shall be imprisoned for not more than 5 years, or fined not more than $250,000 or both. If they didn't get married for love, that's a felony. We need to dispense with the misconception that violating the immigration code is not a crime. The other reason why we typically process things through the civil process rather than through the criminal process is because civil procedure requires less due process. And this brings up the next question. Are people being deported without due process? This comes up all the time. Naturally, if you're going to punish somebody for a crime related to a violation of the immigration code, then the Fifth Amendment due process rights, which say that no person shall be deprived without life, liberty, or property without due process of law, are going to be more stringent than if you process them through civil procedure. The reason for that is because civil procedure, in terms of the scales of justice, takes away less of your life, liberty, and property than a crime does. But this is why the burden of proof is the highest for crimes, beyond a reasonable doubt, and it's lesser for civil violations. So it's not that people are being denied due process, it's just that when they go through the civil system, there's an actual sliding scale of how much process they are given. Civil procedure still requires due process, but it is fair to say that it requires less than criminal procedure. In fact, there is a perfect example of this even within asylum claims, a credible fear screening. What we're gonna do from here is you're gonna have an interview with a USCIS officer. If you pass that interview, then you can actually make your application for asylum, but you can't do it until you jump through that hoop. And this is the way that we balance due process with the overall justice system. And just for those of you who are wondering, about 68% of people pass credible fear screenings. That's pretty high. And yes, if you are a random person who just shows up at our doorstep and claims asylum, that is going to give you less credence when it comes to due process than somebody who was legally admitted through a designated port of entry into the country. Any other country on earth would do that. That's not a denial of due process. That's just how much process do you get? Let's move on. Can ICE wear masks and hide their identity?
No law enforcement professional wears a mask. None.
Right, so there's not just one simple rule here that says all federal agents can wear masks or no federal agents can wear masks, and it appears to be that the sheriff of Philadelphia County is also confused by that. I don't know, 4 years ago they were screaming put them on, now they're screaming take them off. Here we are. So here's how this works. Yes, in certain situations, certain agencies allow it, and the overall question of whether officers can wear masks isn't really a legal question at all. It's a policy question that's done at the department level. I'll put it to you this way. When that incident happened in Minneapolis, that officer was doxxed the same day and his name is now everywhere. Masks didn't help at all. On top of that, and you can fight me on this, but I'm going to assume that the Department of Homeland Security knows a little bit more about this information than you do. There have been credible bounties put out by Mexican drug cartels for assaulting or even killing ICE officers. Now, that kind of stuff isn't online Twitter fighting. That's real world, real life dangerous. So in this case, DHS must balance the issue of keeping officers and their families safe and balancing the public trust. Now, does putting every officer in a mask help increase public trust? No, it doesn't. But also having their faces with how much facial recognition technology is out there now is also incredibly dangerous. And honestly, there could be an entire video just on this topic, but for the purposes of the basic question, can ICE wear masks? The answer is just yes. Does ICE have immunity from prosecution? So by default, no. Officers don't just get a magic wand that they can wave around and make them immune from prosecution for committing a crime. That's not how any form of law enforcement has worked, much less immigration enforcement. But this is where distinction and nuance matters. If somebody physically interferes or tries to assault an officer or harm an officer in any way, and that officer turns and defends themselves from that person, that is going to be something that they're not going to be prosecuted for because they're lawfully doing their job. That is not some special exception for ICE. This happens both with federal law enforcement and with local law enforcement and state law enforcement and any law enforcement. That said, the on-the-ground reality of how law enforcement is done comes down to a variety of factors. And anytime you get human beings doing anything, human beings can and do make mistakes. That goes for officers and civilians, but it doesn't also mean that mistakes are the same as active criminality. The bottom line is that officers are sometimes forced to make ambiguous use of force or other enforcement decisions in split-second moments that, when you actually get down to it, can have an infinite level of nuance. And that's kind of why we fight about it so much. If you want a free education in this area, go watch Donut Operator. Now, I say all that to end with this. That doesn't mean that officers are immune from prosecution if they're just out there committing direct crimes. But it also doesn't mean they're committing a crime just because you don't agree with them. And it definitely doesn't mean that the ultimate decider of fact is the court of public opinion. Can you follow ICE and record them? This is important because it's happening a lot right now. As a general rule, following and recording ICE is the same with any other form of law enforcement. You are allowed to stand in a public place and film officers who are also in a public place so long as you are legally allowed to be where you are standing. Courts have long upheld this as a First Amendment right, though it is sometimes restricted by time, place, and manner restrictions. However, and I mean this as a huge however, following ICE and recording them is also where people seem to constantly be getting into trouble. So let's be clear about this. Following and recording is one thing. Tailgating, interfering, blocking, and obstructing is entirely different. Physically inserting yourself into a lawful operation is not the same thing. And that can become a felony very quickly, according to Title 18 of the US Code, Section 111. That makes it a crime to forcibly assault, resist, oppose, impede, intimidate, or interfere with any protected officer of the United States while they are engaged in or on account of the performance of official duties. So as a general rule, yes, you can film, but stay back and stay peaceful. As another general rule, the closer you get to the actual incident and the more aggressive you become, the more likely it is that someone is going to get confused or take what you're doing as a sign of interference. As a result, the more likely it is that you'll be arrested because you might not entirely understand what's happening in the situation. And while even accidentally getting in the way might not actually get you into legal trouble in the long run, you still might be detained for quite some time, and there might be questions that arise as to your intent, especially if you were known to have been following and recording beforehand. Can states or even cities resist ICE enforcement?
I've issued a warning order to prepare the Minnesota National Guard, and these National Guard troops are our National Guard troops.
So first and foremost, the Constitution has what's known as the Supremacy Clause, which makes it the supreme law of the land, whether you like it or not. And it was the Civil War that settled that question once and for all. Not happy about that? Neither is the South. Anyway, the federal government generally has the authority when push comes to shove. And that's not me arguing in favor of it, it's just telling you the way that it is. Now, when it comes to law enforcement and ICE enforcement, states and cities can choose whether or not they want to participate alongside the federal agency. So they can choose to help, but they cannot choose to obstruct. This follows a more broader theme in American law, which basically says that the federal government cannot force states or cities to participate with their local resources in a federal action. But it also says that they can't get in the way. Think about it this way. You can refuse to give your neighbor a ride to the airport if they want one. What you couldn't do is then walk over to their car and slash their tires. That would not be okay. Same thing here. Can you resist ICE enforcement? I've heard it said online that you can legally resist an officer if you know that their commands are unlawful. Well, this is, in the most abstract legal sense, technically true. It's also one of the dumbest and most dangerous things that I've ever heard people say. Look, if an officer says, hey, take this baseball bat and go beat up grandmother with it, then obviously that's an unlawful order, and God forbid you're ever in that situation. If you are, something's gone seriously wrong.
Something is wrong here.
The dangerous thing here is that often what people mean when they say, they gave me an unlawful order, is that they just simply reject the officer's authority. They don't recognize it, and therefore to them it's unlawful. That's not how unlawful works. That's gonna get you killed. If an officer says, put your hands above your head, or get down on the ground, or show me your hands, or stop, these are not unlawful commands. You could refuse consent to be searched. That doesn't mean you won't be searched. You can remain silent. That doesn't mean they won't ask you questions. And you can stand at a safe distance and record. That doesn't mean they might not tell you to please get back. You can ask for an attorney, you can ask if you're free to leave, and you can definitely challenge actions later in court, but you cannot physically resist law enforcement, and you cannot obstruct law enforcement, even if you think they are wrong and you reject their authority. And for those who are still not getting it, attempting to litigate the matter right then and there on the street, turning a legal argument into a physical altercation, is going to end with extra charges, injury, or God forbid somebody dies. Do not do this. And for the record, this is not me telling you to surrender your rights. This is me telling you to use your head and use your rights in a way that is actually useful. All right, last question. Are we just blaming ICE for enforcing the law, or is something else going on here? The bottom line is that if Congress writes the immigration laws and you hate those laws, then you should talk to Congress. But it's also fair to say that the laws which Congress passes involves choices, directives, interpretations, and bureaucratic policy decisions that are outside the hands of any elected official. Who you arrest, how much force is used, and how you process people overall are generally policy decisions that are made inside of the agency at the agency level. And obviously, these choices matter. So it is possible that we are blaming ICE for just merely enforcing the law, but it's also possible that they can be making choices of how they enforce the law, which you disagree with. You can still support immigration enforcement and be critical of how things are done in certain situations. That's not hypocrisy, that's how accountability works. So where do we go from here? Here's the adult answer. Every man's way is right in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the heart. Proverbs 21:2. If in your heart you've come to believe that America is a hateful place built on slavery and there's nothing good about it, then nothing I've said in this video or the points I've made are going to convince you otherwise, so I won't try. And if in your heart you've already come to the belief that we should just deport them all, regardless of anything, then you've forgotten where we come from and the ideals of America. And at the end of the day, our ideals, and the chance to live up to them, is all we really have as Americans. Life, liberty, and property, the pursuit of happiness, well-ordered freedom governed by the just rule of law. That's the whole damn thing. Now, in saying that, I'm obviously aware that there are some people who will hear that and laugh and say, those ideals never worked to begin with and they're definitely dead now. To which my response is, then why are you fighting? You either believe in American ideals or you just want to see the world burn. And if you just want to see the world burn, then you've already proven the point of the other side. In my opinion, the best version of American immigration, the ideal, is a system that's firm enough to be real and lawful enough to be trusted. And if that is our ideal, and we are but men, then perhaps we shouldn't be too surprised if things don't work out perfectly at every step along the way. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this episode. It's the longest one I've ever done, so thank you for watching all the way to this point. I truly do hope that you learned something, and I truly do hope that you're having a wonderful day. If you'd like to see me do other video topics, let me know in the comments. Consider subscribing if you liked this. I'll be doing more, trying to do one every week here. Stay classy out there, people. Stay safe. Try to remember we're all on the same team at the end of the day. I hope. See ya.